are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, practices of military leaders, and distill from them lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the classic texts in not just military power, but really military and political power, almost governance, and that is The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. So this is my copy of the book. This is published by Eaton Press. Where's the frontispiece so you can just see it? And there's a picture of Machiavelli, and you can see this. These are very beautiful copies. They have the gold on the end papers and all of that. They're leather bound, and it's a pleasure to read a book of this quality. So Machiavelli has quite a reputation, I'll say, and the phrase, of course, Machiavellian, is in the lexicon, and it really refers to doing something underhanded, or of a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Shoot, the word's not coming to mind, but doing of a conspiratorial nature. And I think that's somewhat of a misread of Machiavelli. It's taking part of what he says and making it the whole thing that he's about. So I want to start by giving you just a brief biography of Niccolo Machiavelli himself, so you can understand his background. He was not a military man in the sense of a soldier or a general or an officer of some kind in the military. He was, in fact, a diplomat, a political thinker, an historian, and a writer. So he was born in Florence in 1469. Florence, of course, at that time, at that time, Italy was not a united country. It was a series of principalities, Florence being one of them, Milan. The major cities really were essentially the seats of principalities that made up what eventually became modern Italy. And when Machiavelli was at the height of his influence, we'll say, it was when he served for about a decade the Florentine Republic, and he held several key roles in diplomatic and military affairs during those 10 years. So Florence previously was run by the Medicis, which is one of the best known families in Italy. The family was expelled from Florence in 1494, and that started the Republican period. When the Medicis returned to power in 1512, with the backing of Pope Julius II, so Machiavelli, who had been loyal to the Republic, he was removed from office, and subsequently he was accused of conspiring against the Medicis, who then imprisoned him and at least briefly tortured him. So eventually he was released from prison, but he was barred from government service for the rest of his life, and he withdrew to his estate outside of Florence, and in exile he turned to writing. And The Prince, which he wrote in 1513, but which was not published until 1532, is far and away his best known work. And it set out pragmatic guidelines for statecraft, basically. Now, some of these principles might sort of be offensive to modern sensibilities, but the reality is they are still used today. And an intelligent and sensible ruler will minimally be aware of these ideas and these tools, because he may face them coming from another country, an adversary, or even an ally. Okay, now just to wrap up Machiavelli's biography, he did write other works. He wrote histories, he wrote some plays. His other well-known book is Discourses on Livy. Livy was a Roman historian, and he, I think rightly so, earned a reputation as one of the founders of modern political science. And Machiavelli died in Florence in 1527. So, he lived for about 58 years, thereabouts, 57, 58 years, and had, to this day, a profound impact on the way rulers rule countries. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that at a time when most countries were monarchies or principalities, dukedoms, whatever, Machiavelli worked in a republic, okay, which is what, for example, the United States is. People call our country a democracy, but we're not. We're a republic. The difference being, in a democracy, every citizen votes on every issue. In a republic, citizens elect representatives who then represent them in the government and vote on and create the various legislative initiatives, etc., that are used to run the country. So the Prince is divided into 26 chapters. So you can see just a part of them there. That's about half of them. And here's the other half right there. Okay. And without going into every one, you can, by the way, you can see the book. It's not particularly long, a couple of hundred pages, as I recall. Not even that, 185 pages, at least in this edition. So it's a fairly quick book to read. So without going through what's covered in every chapter, there are a few ideas that I want to pull out from the Prince that then I'm going to, in some cases, expand on when I talk about the business lessons we can learn from the Prince. So Machiavelli starts out by talking about the different kinds of principalities, hereditary or new, or each, and he talks about how each type of principality requires a different style of governance. So that, again, that's where he starts. And then he talks about some different aspects, both historical and philosophical, in statecraft. So in chapter 4, for example, he talks about why Alexander's empire didn't rebel. Alexander being Alexander the Great, the one of the most notable conquerors in human history. So what he observes is centralized states are harder to conquer, but easier to hold because power is centralized. Decentralized states are easier to conquer because power is diffuse, but they're harder to hold because that power is diffuse. So just as a principle, okay, that undergirds much of how Machiavelli looks at statecraft. And I think, while I'm not going to talk about this in the context of a business lesson, I think we can see that in business, there are businesses where the founder or the senior leadership running the business. They keep a very, very tight hold on the business. Okay. And so that can make it easier, for example, for the business to be taken over. But the business does what the senior leadership wants them to do. On the other hand, decentralized businesses where power is more diffuse, so they may be easier to acquire, to conquer in that sense, but they're harder to hold on to. They're harder to hold control over once once an acquirer owns the business, because again, power is diffuse. Okay, so another one of his principles, and this is one of the controversial ones, is ruling through what he calls wickedness. So power gained by cruelty can last, excuse me, if it's used decisively, but, and this is the big but not excessively, right? And so he talks about this again, but that by the way, that's chapter 8. In chapter 17, he talks about cruelty and compassion, and he says it's better to be feared than loved, but never hated, right? So from a leader's standpoint, uh, that's his perspective on being an effective leader in the 15th and into the um, I'm sorry, in the 15th into the 16th century. So I'm going to talk about this as it applies to business. So I'll kind of put a pin in that one for right now. Okay, civil principalities, that is, those with civilian support. So in chapter 9, he talks about how a ruler backed by the common people is more secure than one backed only by nobles. Now that obviously came out of his working within a republic where the Medicis, the nobles, had been essentially deposed, and now the more general populace, what essentially were the rulers of the country, or they had to back the ruler in order for the ruler to be able to reign, so to speak. Okay, so again, I'll talk about that a little bit more. On mercenaries in chapter 12. So he says mercenaries, of course, are soldiers that are hired to do fighting as opposed to citizen soldiers, right? See, the United States has never used mercenary, at least not in any large degree. Maybe in covert actions, the United States has, but World War I, World War II, the Civil War, there were no mercenaries. They were all citizen soldiers. So Machiavelli's take on mercenaries are they're disloyal, they're undisciplined, and they're dangerous to rely on, right? Because the hold that a ruler has over mercenaries is monetary, not philosophical, right? And so if they don't get paid, well, they'll walk off, because if they're not getting paid, they have no reason to fight anymore. Okay. Next, in chapter 20 on fortresses and arms, so Machiavelli recognizes that fortifications are less useful than loyalty and good governance, right? And in doing so, in governing well and in gaining the loyalty of the populace, that means that you have a citizenry that will defend the state, as opposed to having to build fortifications, which even then technology was learning how to overcome. Okay. And then just a couple more to give you a little bit more flavor of the book. So in chapter 23, he talks about avoiding flatterers. So a ruler must seek honest counsel and avoid sycophants. I think, again, I think I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Let's see. No, actually, that's not one of the principles I'm going to talk about. So I'll mention it here. From the standpoint of running a business or a professional practice, so having wise, honest counselors is crucial, especially if you don't have a big organization. And I know in my own practice, there have been times when I should have sought more counsel than I did. Had I probably would have avoided some of the mistakes that I made. Okay. And so the worst thing we can do is hire consultants or um, employees who will just nod their heads, yes, yes, yes. Like the in Blazing Saddles, Mel Brooks plays the governor of the state that in which it takes place, which goes unnamed, and he has all yes men around the table, and of course that's deadly to anybody in a leadership position, right? We need to have people who will speak truth to power, as a Marine Corps colonel once said to me as a compliment. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, and then finally on fortune. So half of human success, says Machiavelli, is luck, and the other half is skill and boldness. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. We tend to think that, oh, all of our success is due to, us. But that's not really true. Now, if you have a God-centered view of the world, you might say, well, there's no such thing as luck. And I would certainly agree with that. There is no there from the standpoint of God running the world, there is no such thing as luck, but there is, in essence, God's grace or God's intervention, right? And so we can pray for that, but we can't count on it. And so I think what Machiavelli is saying here is don't get all caught up in your own PR, right? Recognize that at least half of what happens in your life is not something that you control, and be mindful of that as you make decisions. Okay, but otherwise, build your skills and be bold. That is the recipe for success. Okay, so that gives you an idea of some of the philosophy in that Machiavelli talks about in the Prince. So let's talk about some business lessons now. Okay, and number one, the first lesson is power comes from competence and control. Okay, so this one kind of combines some of the lessons, but Machiavelli, kind of pulling together several of aspects of his philosophy. So a prince can't depend on mercenaries or auxiliaries, but only a trained force under his command can truly secure power, right? And so in business, uh, sometimes companies rely too heavily on consultants or freelancers, and in doing so, they risk instability, or they risk not really understanding what their business is about. So the strongest organizations, they invest in building internal capabilities. Now, does that mean that all your capabilities have to be internal? And I think that's not the case, and I don't think that that's what Machiavelli was saying either. What he was saying is the core capabilities that allow a leader to remain in power, translated into business, the core capabilities that make a company vital, that are central to its success, those should be internal. Okay. Other capabilities, though, can be external, right? So I think Boeing is a good example of this if you've been following what's been going on with Boeing for the last few years. So they started a program of contracting out large parts of the construction of their aircrafts, and especially the Dreamliner, the 787. And it turned out it was disastrous for them. They lost control of their quality control. Okay. And so one of their prime subcontractors, they've now, originally it was part of Boeing. They spun it off as a separate company, and now they're reacquiring that company. And it's the one that makes the fuselages, right? That everything else attaches to. So it's not that Boeing has to make every part of its jets in order to be successful, but it has to recognize what are the core capabilities, what is most important to building a quality airplane. Those are the capabilities it needs to have internally. And the new CEO, whose name has been in the news the last day or so, I'm not recalling it, but anyway, that's one of the things that he's looked at most closely is what does Boeing need to bring back in house in order to um, have competence and control over the central aspects of aircraft manufacturing. Okay, so the hard question for us all to answer is what really is the core part of our businesses. Okay, and what can we essentially contract out? So I know for my company, the core part of my business is understanding the trust and estate administration process and how the various pieces need to work together in order to create as smooth an administration as possible. What I don't need to know is, or what I don't have to have in house. Let me put it that way. It's not I don't need to know it. What I don't need to have in house is, for example, the ability to sell a piece of real estate, or for that matter, to manage a piece of real estate, or to manage securities and securities, bonds, stocks, etc. Those are not core capabilities for my practice, and in fact, I'm better off contracting those out to experts, okay, while I focus on my core capabilities, which is the administration, the coordination of all the moving parts involved in any particular estate. Okay, so power comes from competence and control. Let's take a break. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. All right, so this is Business Lessons from the Military, and I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. I'm talking about one of the classic texts of military power and statecraft, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. Gave you a short, if you're just joining me now, I gave you a short biography of Machiavelli and talked about some of the key points in his philosophy. And now I'm going through some business lessons that we can take from the Prince. Okay, so number one, power comes from competence and control. Number two, adapt or fail. Okay, so Machiavelli, again, you would get this from reading the overall book. A successful prince adjusts his strategy to the shifting humors, attitudes, what were called humors then, of the people, and to the unpredictability of fortune, right? So in the Marine Corps, we used to say Semper Gumby, right? And Gumby being the claymation cartoon figure, very popular in the, I believe, 1960s, 1950s and 60s. He had a pal, a horse named Pokey. Okay, I had a Pokey when I was a little kid that I loved, and you could bend him all around, right? And the idea is uh, one has to stay flexible. So in business, right? Markets, technology, consumer preferences, they change. Sometimes they change rapidly, okay? And survival depends on agility, right? And so to stay too hidebound to a particular path, especially these days, will almost surely mean that your business becomes irrelevant, right? So look at a company like Kellogg's, the cereal maker, right? So Kellogg's of Battle Creek, Michigan, where the company was founded and is still based, right, was a maker of breakfast cereals. Okay, Kellogg's Special K, one of my favorites growing up. Lots of different cereals. And here's the thing, and it was a successful company for decades and decades and decades. And eventually Kellogg's expanded into other products, and one of the things they found starting maybe about 10, 15 years ago, thereabouts, was children were not eating breakfast cereal in the same amounts that prior generations had. So, whereas cereal is a carbohydrate based food, generally speaking, made from grains, wheat, corn, etc. Uh, nutritionists were touting having protein for breakfast, so eggs, meat, those kind of things. And so cereal as a breakfast, the cereal's popularity as a breakfast food has been declining. And I think that, Kellogg's was a little slow realizing that. And as a result, eventually what they did is they split Kellogg's into two companies. There was Kenover that I believe was the part of it that um, that held the more sort of current products, if you will. And then there was the cereal company. And unfortunately, Kellogg's is still struggling to keep up and stay relevant. And I think one of the reasons is they are fundamentally a cereal based company, right? So even the other products that they acquired were more in the same vein, with cereal bars and that kind of stuff, right? And so if they had gotten into protein bars, maybe that would be different. Okay, but that's not really what they did. And so they're really struggling to adapt. And if they don't, they will end up failing, right? And lots of companies do. The reality of the capitalist system, the free market system, is not every company is meant to survive forever, right? And so it again, one of the most difficult judgment calls we have to make is it time for a company to wrap up, or is it time for a company to dramatically shrink in size, maybe become an adjunct of a larger company, but recognize that the trend is away from the products that this company is selling. So on a smaller, kind of more local basis, so one of my favorite chocolatiers here in Los Angeles is John Kelly. So John Kelly started, I think, about 15, maybe 20 years ago, and they make what the French would call bonbons, filled chocolate. So chocolate covered, like they have most of their chocolates have a fudge type filling. They are extraordinary. So, for example, they have a vanilla walnut chocolate covered bonbon that is, it's just scrumptious. There's no other way about it. I shared some with my sister a couple 3 weeks ago, and she loved them. She's not a big dark chocolate fan, but these chocolates are marvelous. So I hadn't been to John Kelly's for a while, and when I went to pick up some chocolates to share with my sister, I went to their main shop in Hollywood, and I noticed on the shelves they were, in addition to John Kelly, they were also selling Charles chocolates. Now I know Charles Chocolates is a San Francisco-based chocolatier, different kind of chocolate products than John Kelly. They sell like chocolate covered nuts and things like that, and more bar chocolate, like bars of chocolate, and they're fantastic as well. Okay, just different than John Kelly. So I asked the lady behind the counter about it. She said, "Oh well, John Kelly sold to Charles Chocolates." Oh, I asked her, why did they do that? She said, well, Charles Chocolates has better established distribution channels, and it was the most sensible way for John Kelly to expand. Now, by the way, John Kelly, it's two men, John and Kelly, who started the business, right? They could have continued to try and expand on their own, but by joining with another premium chocolatier that already has established distribution channels, they enabled their growth to happen much more surely and rapidly, right? So they're adapting to the market realities. Okay. And in doing so, I think their business will, be even better. Now, interestingly enough, and John Kelly here in Los Angeles has two stores, one in Hollywood that I just mentioned, another in Santa Monica on Montana Avenue. I'll give them a free plug. They, for a while, had a store in Beverly Hills as well. And I noticed driving by where the store was a few weeks ago, it wasn't there anymore. So I also asked the lady about that. She said, yeah, we closed that location. It just wasn't working out. Good for them, right? Now, not good for me because that was the closest location. So I have to go, farther away to get my John Kelly's chocolates. Um, but smart for them to adapt to market realities rather than end up failing, right? I'm sure it was an expensive location. There's no such thing as inexpensive real estate in Beverly Hills, as you might imagine, right? So adapt or fail. And this is why astute leadership that will be bold but will also be honest with itself is important. Okay, that's number two, adapt or fail. Number three, perception is reality. So Machiavelli says a prince must appear merciful, faithful, humane, and religious, even if at times he must act otherwise. Okay, and I think that's important, right? We want to act with integrity, and that's the goal. Certainly, we certainly want to act with honesty, um, but the reality is sometimes we just can't be, quote unquote, merciful when we're operating a business. Now, of course, we're not talking about, God forbid, killing people like you might have in a war. Of course not. But we may have to lay people off. We may have to fire people. It's not a pleasant thing to do. And even though we cultivate an image of faithfulness and trustworthiness, humanity, um, you know, sometimes that may take a bit of a hit when we have to do what needs to be done in order for the business to remain successful. And the example I just gave, I think, is one of the best ones, and that is sometimes we have to let people go. Okay, either because they're not performing well, and so they're a detriment to the business, or because the business needs to revamp, go in another direction. Maybe it needs to contract for a while, so we need to lay people off. it's never pleasant to do that, to tell somebody, hey, you're not going to be working here anymore after whatever the next week, 2 weeks, month, whatever the period is. Okay. But the fact that sometimes we have to do things that at least some other people will view as harsh doesn't mean that we should just allow the people who think we're being harsh to define who we are. Okay. We need to create the perception. We need to create how our businesses and practices will be viewed. Okay, and make that the reality, understanding that sometimes reality is going to be different than the image we put forth. It's just how it is. Okay, now, by the way, let's say we do have to lay some people off. Okay, but when we want to maintain our appearance of a humane company, well, how we do it matters. Okay, now, no matter how humanely we lay people off, uh, they may still be angry, they may accuse the company of being heartless. Okay, nothing you can do about that, right? But providing people with uh, you know salary in lieu of notice, or providing them transition assistance, training to find a new job somewhere else, those kinds of things, they can make the disruption in people's lives more humane, right? Uh, but it won't necessarily prevent them from accusing us of, being inhumane in that sense, right? So we want to stick with the image that we create, make it as close to reality as possible, but we can't be a slave to that image if it means that the business will fail. Okay, so that's number three. Perception is reality. Number four, uh, this will be a little bit controversial, I think, but you'll see this came from one of the principles I mentioned before. Better to be feared than loved, within limits, right? So Machiavelli, if you recall, he said, if forced to choose, fear secures loyalty better than love, but hatred must be avoided. That's his principle. So I wouldn't in a business, of course, fear is not, we don't want to go all the way to fear. What I would say is better to be respected than loved. That's what's most important in business. And respect comes from how we run a business, how we run our professional practices. Okay. So, leaders who command respect through high standards achieve stronger results than those who really strive to be liked or loved. Okay. I'll give you an example. This is not a business example per se. This is actually a military example, but I think it's indicative of this issue. So, when I was in the Navy, uh, we were getting ready to deploy on our ship, the USS Ronald Reagan. I was Air Wing chaplain at the time. And a message went out to all the senior leadership on the ship that the captain of another nuclear aircraft carrier was under investigation for improper conduct. What had he done? He had recorded a video of sailors, himself and sailors, in the men's showers, and he was snapping other sailors' behinds with his towel. Now, if you've been in junior high school in a locker room, at least when I was in junior high, there were friends going around snapping guys in the backside with towels. That was pretty much de rigueur back then. I don't know if it goes on now. Haven't been in a men's locker room in a long time. Okay. But the idea, and he not only made the video, but he played it on the ship's video network so that everybody on the ship could see it. And as you might guess, on a ship where 80+% of the sailors are mid-20s and younger, for the most part, they loved this video. It was very off color, and they dug it. But there were a small group of people who looked at this in a different light, i.e., that the captain of a nuclear aircraft carrier should not be behaving in that off-colored manner. And it really came down to this particular officer wanted to be loved by his crew. It wasn't enough for him to command the respect of being a captain of a nuclear aircraft carrier, one of the most challenging and sought after commands in the United States Navy. He wanted the adulation of his sailors. And for his trouble, he was relieved from command. As well he should have been. Right? That's not what he's there to do. Right? What's going to happen if that ship is in a crisis? Does he really think his sailors are 100% on board? I hope not, because what he did was foolish. And when they really thought about what he was doing, I think his sailors would have been less likely to follow his leadership. Okay? I think this is why we're seeing with increasing frequency companies who are firing senior leaders who, for example, get involved in affairs with underlings, with people more junior to them, especially if the senior leader is married and he's having an affair with someone who's, by definition, not his wife or not her husband, right? That does not breed respect among leadership. Okay? And that's what leaders need. They need to be respected. They need to behave respectably. Okay? Respectfully and respectably. Okay? And so I think that's how we translate Machiavelli's idea about better to be feared than loved, better to be respected than loved. Okay, that's what we should strive for as leaders in business. Okay, that's number 4. Number 5, manage risk through independence. So again, this is related to some of the philosophies that I mentioned at the beginning. Princes who depend on mercenaries or foreign powers eventually lose control. Okay, and this is I think related to the first idea, which is power comes from competence and control. So we really, as businesses, we need to maintain our ability to act independently. Okay. And if we are over reliant on one supplier, one partner, or one customer, so this is likely to expose our business to big swings, if not a cataclysmic failure. So my first company, when back before I joined the Navy, I had a real estate appraisal and management company here in Los Angeles. And unfortunately, the business developed in a way that one of my clients was responsible for about half my income. And I realized that, unfortunately, in a way, too late to do, to solve the problem, i.e., to diversify my clientele. And there was a point at which this client had a changeover in management, and the new management decided that it was a large publicly traded lender. The new management decided that they didn't want to deal with small contractors like me They only wanted to deal with very large contractors. So if a problem ever arose, they'd have deep pockets that they could sue. And so they stopped giving me business. And as a result, my business struggled quite a bit for quite a while I figured out how to, get that ship righted, to use a Navy term, right? And the same thing happens. It can happen kind of reverse, where a business is too reliant on one supplier. What happens if that supplier has problems, and now you need these crucial parts and you can't get them, right? This is part of the strategy behind the international relations of the United States and China. So the United States wants to stay dominant in AI development. And one of the ways they're doing that is by prohibiting NVIDIA from selling to China, not giving to China, selling to China the state of the art chips, microchips that are necessary for developing more advanced AI, right? And so, and China, recognizing that this is the situation now, so they are working to incentivize their domestic chip suppliers to creating the kinds of chips, the sophistication, the chips of a higher level of sophistication and technology, so that they aren't reliant on NVIDIA chips, right? And all of this plays into managing risk through independence. So we need to look at our businesses and our practices and look, where is our revenue coming? Who are our key suppliers? What will happen if one of those suppliers has a problem and no longer can supply us? Who are our key contractors who, while their capability is not a capability that's central to our business or practice, nonetheless is an important capability on which we rely in serving our customers or clients? And what are we going to do if that key contractor is no longer able to deliver, right? All of these are part of managing risk through independence. And it may be that we need to develop a relationship with more than one supplier, more than one contractor, so that we have some duplication and are not 100% reliant on what becomes a sole point of failure. Okay, so manage risk through independence. Okay, and then finally, balance fortune with what Machiavelli calls virtue, and this gets back to one of the last points that I mentioned. So, fortune controls half of events. Boldness and skill allow leaders to shape outcomes, right? So again, whether you believe in luck or whether you believe in God, either one of those work within this idea. Okay, so what we have to do is be bold in deploying our skills to shape outcomes as best as we possibly can. Okay, so in business, we don't control the market. We don't control the economy. We don't control changes in customer, client, or investor sentiments. Okay, what we can control is how well we seek to understand those variables, and then how we respond to them. Okay, so let's take the recent example of the imposition of tariffs, right? Although President Trump and his incoming administration had made it clear they were going to impose tariffs, I'm not sure businesses were as ready for that as they probably should have been. Maybe they just didn't think that in the end President Trump would impose the tariffs, or maybe they just weren't prepared for how broad the tariffs, how broad the imposition of the tariffs was. Can't say. What I can say is it created a lot of turmoil for businesses, and probably more than it needed to if businesses had planned ahead, if they had planned some bold action. Now, some companies did plan to take bold action. And so, for example, knowing that tariffs were going to be imposed at certain dates, they bought a lot of product, a lot of components that they needed for their businesses that they were getting from outside the country before the tariffs were imposed. And in that way, they mitigated at least some of the turmoil and some of the expense that the imposition of tariffs would have created. Okay, good. It's that kind of foresight we need to work to develop. And then we need to have the courage of our convictions to act boldly, right? And that's really, I think, what Machiavelli is getting at in its essence, especially in this point, is there's lots and lots of things that we cannot control as leaders of principalities and moving into the business world as people who run businesses, who lead businesses, who have professional practices. Lots of things we can't control. That does not mean we can resign ourselves to the vicissitudes of life. Quite to the contrary. We need to keep abreast of what's going on as well as possible. We need to think about what these potential changes may mean, and we need to make plans and execute on those plans rather than allowing ourselves to be overtaken by events. And so that is, I think, what we can learn from Machiavelli's The Prince about running our businesses, about business lessons. And if we follow Machiavelli's advice, we are more likely to be successful and build enduring organizations. So I thank you very much for joining me today, especially live viewers, always a treat. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. Hope you'll join me for that. And then a week from next week on Monday, 10 a.m. is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. And then I actually will be off on Tuesday of next week for additional Jewish holidays. But normally we would be back in 7 days for the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you very much for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are